Hey, what's up, brothers and sisters? Welcome to Herstory, the Hisstory Part 2. Just a quick reminder, throughout this video, remember if you see some slides or captions on the screen that may be unfamiliar to you, remember to pause and read the screen. Also, remember to pay close attention to the screen because you might miss something. And I'm also teaching with the visuals as well. So watch the transitions because the transitions is what's going to be teaching you the sacred geometry and more things as well. So just keep that in mind. Now let's get right into it, guys. Greeks and Egyptians, Africans and Europeans both accredit the dawn of civilization to Narmer. If Narmer was the first pharaoh to rule in Egypt, why does he have a Greek name? And I also find it strange that most of the so-called Kemetic scholars, they are also black Greeks. Remember, I told you we were in a Greco-Egyptian time. A microcosm of Greco-Egyptian can be Scottish Rite and Prince Hall. There were black and white pharaohs, and it still are today. Remember that we traded our family crest, our natural inheritance, for national flags. But if you look at the Greek fraternities, they all still have family crests. They call each other brothers and sisters. They get privileges you don't get. And most of your Kemetic scholars are black Greeks. So right there, you can see the Greco-Egyptian influence and the hidden hand, the double-headed dragon that ruled his nation. The Boule and Skull and Bones, Congress, and the Black Congressional Caucus. So at the end of this matriarch versus patriarch war, as we was leaving the Garden of Eden, we end up at 3100 BC with the beginning of what they call civilization. They're saying, now we have you guys civilized. We have the earth tamed, the animals tamed, the patriarchs ruling, and the peasants are in their place, and they have burnt the witches, which were the women who still was practicing the old practices of herbal healing and natural things, getting rid of these old records of our pre-dynastic origins and getting rid of the knowledge of nature. So they was burning a lot of women who they was calling witches, who still was passing this knowledge down of the plants, telling people how to self-sustain their villages. And they was getting rid of this knowledge and monopolizing it, recreating it all under different patriarchal entities such as Imhotep, which became the father of medicine, which before him we know we had great mothers healing the humans with herbs. And what he represents is the beginning of medical institutions and treatments, which is anti-nature. So we left nature and now we're in a male-ruled patriarchy, and I'm just showing you how that happened. So when we talk about gender wars, we're talking about the feminine, masculine ideologies that could govern any society. The first natural ones being matriarchal. When you talk gender, you have the root word gen, which deals with genes or genetics. And this is why the first book of the Bible is called Genesis. We're going to talk about that more as well. We're going to do the etymology of Genesis. If you watch the Ripple Effect series, you can catch up on that. So the reason the timeline is split and you have an in the beginning that's not the beginning is because that beginning represents the beginning of the patriarchal world and the end of the matriarchal world. That beginning represents the end of the gender wars and the beginning of the Genesis, which is the new line of succession through the males and not the woman. So again, we no longer had family crests after this. We had national flags, which is a rectangle shape that's shaped like a coffin, symbolizing death and not life. Before that, we had the family crest, which was the symbol of the uterus, symbolizing life or nature, the abundance of plants during the golden age, as opposed to death, which is the unnatural way we govern our societies today, which creates a predator system and hunting cultures. This showed you how we left our true origins. And remember, you see the word gen in origin, showing you our origination and the laws that was laid down by the creator which was as above, so below. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Listen to your heart, your consciousness. And there's no way you could own a slaughterhouse if you had a consciousness. The first world governments and royal families that started the dynastic age and ended the pre-dynasty age, they rose to power as victors out of those gender wars I just told you about. And with that power began to rule over the world. These were rich hunting cults that had grew to power over hundreds of years during this transitioning era. You supplying a meat addiction for that long, you're going to be very wealthy. You're going to own a lot of land based upon people who left the villages to go to work. And they left their natural land and inheritance. No one wanted to go and work their own little gardens. That got boring. And the new thing was to go to work in what became to be known as cities today, which the people which own these cities and control our world do it because they own the land to plant crops on and have slaughterhouses and basically have control over the things that we need to sustain ourselves naturally. If you can feed yourself and provide clean water for yourself, there will literally be no need to go to work or have a government. The need for a government is only there by depriving us of the natural things that nature gives us as a natural inheritance. So we were kicked out of the Garden of Eden by trading our natural inheritance for labor. We became addicts. Now we have to work for someone else to eat because it takes male corporations or male organizations or male cults, male teams to provide massive meat, to hunt in bulk. Even with today's slaughterhouses, it still take a collective of males to maintain, for the fact that it take a lot of brute force. As opposed to gardening, a child can run a garden. A man or a woman can do it. But we enter an age of males ruling it all, a man's world, and we left that golden age of unisex rule where the family was to gather, gathering herbs in the garden. To gather, you gather it up together. When the males took over and the hunting societies rose, the families broke up because now all of the males have to go out and do hunting every day to bring a daily catch, as opposed to the males staying home in the village with the women and the children, and we all just maintaining the earth and the land. So when we started to form the male secret societies and hunting cults, those first male hunting cults and societies that supplied these meat-eating addictions over time became very wealthy and ended up becoming your royal families that eventually ended up becoming the powers, what we call Greece and Egypt. So all of these nations were born from families. You have to remember that these families, these royal families that run these nations, predate the nation. And I'm showing you how the family rose to power when we left vegan-based golden age societies, when everyone ruled off the land and developed meat-eating habits and meat-eating societies and ideologies. Those first hunting cults that rose to power and got rich first created your first world superpowers and first royal families. And they changed the succession from a matrilineal system that was passed down through the woman to a new beginning of a royal succession that's passed down through the patriarch or the man. That's why in the biblical Genesis, they had to recreate a new human origin story by putting the man first. But since Adam don't have a vagina, they had to create a vagina or a womb on his rib cage to give birth to the woman and the child. It's actually a sick patriarchal story which hides the truth. All of the ancient pre-dynastic stories of human origin say that everything we see around us was birthed out of a cosmic womb from a cosmic mother, just like all life we see around us is birthed from out of an earthly womb or a microcosmic mother. The ancestors said that womb exists at the North Pole where all compasses point to, and that the law of this cosmos is in the central part of every human, which is your heart, your moral compass. Remember that the root word of compassion is compass, and all compasses point to the Garden of Eden, or what's called a North Pole. The ancestors said a great mother or a great womb sat there. But of course, when they changed the spirituality to support meat eating, they replaced the great mother with Santa Claus. In a lot of the older maps, you can see how different markers on the map that pertain to the North Pole were depicted in red and white stripes, and that became your candy cane concept. And we'll talk more about that later as well. How we went from the Madonna and Child, which shows the life-giving role of the womb, how the mother is nursing the baby on her lap, and how she was replaced with Santa Claus. And her role in mythology had to be given to the man when we left this golden age. When men took over the throne, women were deleted out of mythology and cursed out of spiritual texts. That's why Eve in the garden represents sin, and she's blamed for kicking us out of the garden, when I just told you what happened to take us away from the golden age or garden age. It was the men biting the animals, not the women biting the fruit. So when you talk about in the beginning, again, you're talking about the beginning of a new world based upon the victory of those male patriarchs after those gender wars. The old world had finally failed, and a new world of meat-eating and hunting societies was now born. So during this time, you had a mixed world like you have today. In Egypt and Greece was two powerhouses that were born from those royal families that were born from those first cults. Those males that went out to hunt and provided the meat for these early villages, again, they became very wealthy. So if you was high ranking, your family was very wealthy. This was the beginning of peasants and rulers, because before this, everybody was a ruler because we was all vegans living in abundance off the plants. Now that we became dependent on meats, the man who supplied the meats distributed how he want to distribute it. Nature distributes the fruit evenly to us all, but when you depend on man and not nature, he distributed the way he want to distribute it. And during this time, the richest people were the high-ranking males in those cults, and they family were the most richest. So now you had different classes starting to be born now with the birth of these hunting societies. You had some people that starved, some people that didn't. And these rich people at the top started to unite with each other all over to create what's called government on everybody else. The most powerful cults on the earth started to unite in these world super centers such as Egypt and Greece, which were world melting pots and big time trading places. They were superpowers, but they were superpowers based upon these original families that took control of agriculture and hunting. And these males who grew these hunting cults, their families rose to power and created the world governments. And to this day, they still own the land and the people. And we waiting to get our inheritance back. But this war ain't really about getting guns and shooting. It's about changing what you are, so you don't be dependent on that which preys off of you. So if everybody was vegan right now, that'll crash all of the world powers, because it's the meat industry that supply a lot of the other industries, such as the space program, the prison system. One hand watches the nets. And it's a bit interwoven scheme of corruption and deception that preys on us being in an unnatural state. So this unification that took place was a unification that affected the entire earth, but it took place in Egypt, which was like the world superpower at that time. It would be the America of that time, the first America, of all of these different races and classes of people in a melting pot, merging these different ideologies. And it was a meat-based hunting culture. And there were many superpowers that were similar to Egypt, of course, and ended up unifying with Egypt to maintain the power. So those first royal families that rose to power from those first cults became the world government today. And they're able to maintain their bloodline and trace their succession through practicing nepotism and through oral and written genealogy, such as the Bible, which is a book of succession, which shows you from Genesis how we went from the succession of the matriarch to now we no longer have family crest, which empowers all of us. Out the normer, you have a national flag, and your natural inheritance is forfeited to the royal families. And you agreeing to be basically a slave so that they provide for you instead of you going to work for yourself and nature provide for you. So that was the swap off when we had this shift in consciousness and went from her story to his story. So now we see how we went from autonomous villages of gardeners ruling to males who broke a very important law of nature and started hunting. And we began an exodus out of the garden through a transition area which consisted of gender wars. The end of those gender wars represent the victory of the patriarchs, which was in 3100 BC when this proto-dynastic area was over, or this transitioning area from pre-dynastic to dynastic era was over in the year 3100 BC with the rise of Normer, who is the unified king of both lands, hunting ideologies, and predator-based spiritual systems. And again, this was a unification that infected the entire world. Just like we're taught that the New World Order was going to be all of the nations unified and it's going to affect the entire earth, this happened during this time in 3100 BC. The New World Order took place during this time with the unification of the two biggest world superpowers of that time being Greece and Egypt. So these families rose to power and became very wealthy, overthrew the matriarchal system, and then created government in 3100 BC to maintain this system. So all of those hunting groups that was once in competition said we need to come together and unite against the matriarchal societies. And as a result of that, there was a unification of these patriarchal groups that was a result of the patriarchs winning those gender wars and establishing government to solidify their power after the wars. That solidification or unification was what's called the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt, which is really the uniting of the world's superpowers against the old world matriarch systems. And to this day, the world's superpowers is at war with what they call the primitive ways of living and early gardening cultures, and the Catholic Church is converting the people in the Amazon and Christianity and the spiritual warfare to take this land so that we're dependent on them and we're off of nature's nipple. On their money, it says, "In God we trust." They're putting themselves in the place of God by putting themselves in between us and nature. You see beneath that pyramid on your dollar is New World Order. This New World Order began in 3100 BC, again with the unification of the world's superpowers. A peasantry system was created and equality was lost when we left this age of sovereignty. We no longer depended on the abundance of nature. We depended on the supply of male industry to meet our demand, and it never meets it equally. Therefore, classes were created. We traded our inheritance to go to work to maintain our addictions. In our natural state, there's abundance. So as a result of those gender wars, which were orchestrated by matriarch and patriarchal societies, as a result of those wars, again, the patriarchs won, and at the end of those wars, they established a unification to secure their power that they had stole from the people. And that's what they call the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. That's a new covenant, as Polite call it. But that new covenant was built on top of the old covenant. And that new covenant is a messed up contract that we're under. We must break the new covenant and get back to the old covenant if we want to be sovereign again. And we breaking the new covenant with government and man, and embracing the old covenant with nature and our relationship with the plants. And then we're journeying back to the Garden of Eden. Prior to the two world powers that makes up East and Western world today, there was one world where everyone understood the natural laws of nature and a symbiotic relationship we have with the plants, and we all understood how to sustain our villages just like the animals all understand. So there was one world power, and there was never one person in charge of distributing nature's inheritance to the people. Nature has everything outside your door freely for you to take without having to go through anyone else. At least that's the way life was before government or dynasties during pre-dynastic time. Everyone lived abundantly off the land, and there was one world order that we all understood, which was do unto others if we would have them do unto us, and just live peacefully, enjoy life, eat as much as you like in this heavenly garden. But like I said, with the rise of the male hunters who kicked us out of the garden with hunting, abundance was lost. See, there was no need for a ruler. There was no world superpower other than nature, which provided for us all equally and evenly. And there was no need to measure because it was so much around you in this heavenly garden. You couldn't count it all. There's not a number to explain the amount of abundance that was on this earth. And there was no need for no one to rule over you because nature provided all we needed, and she was the ruler. She measured everything out for her children. And when nature is the ruler, when nature measures things out, it's abundant, it's infinite. So when we talk about rulers, we're talking about measuring instruments. And if nature was the first ruler that measured out everything, listen, when the Most High created this place, the Most High wasn't dumb enough to not make an adequate supply of sustenance for us. When the Most High created this place, abundance was created, an oversupply, perpetual supply, an infinite supply. But you will only know that if you were living by the natural laws as a vegan, and especially during those times when there was more abundance than today. So there was no need for a ruler because nature had it all measured. When the first two world rulers rose to power, they created their kingdom on top of nature's kingdom, and they became the rulers over all there is, including nature. They even try to rule over it, but yet nature prevails. But the reason they call themselves ruler is because these became the new entities that would now measure out the sustenance for society. Prior to the dynasties, nature measured it out during the golden age. But with the rise of the dynasties, the kings and the pharaoh now measured out who gets what in society. And when they started to measure it out, they're not balanced rulers like nature, so they don't get the measurements right. And they often create something called rich and poor. Ma'at holds the golden scales representing the golden age. You never saw a male Ma'at because she represents the golden age when nature was the ruler under matriarchal gardening systems. When men become rulers, you see gods that's not fair. For example, the biblical garden, he don't give to all of his children equally. Some of them he allowed to rule over others. That's not balanced. That's not equal. During this golden age, nature ruled over all of us equal and provided equally. But when we allow men to rule over us, there are different classes. Some people work harder than others, but get less. And it's designed to keep the rich rich and the poor poor. But that's not nature's design. So remember, rulers are responsible for measuring. And the people that rule the world today, the way they measure out resources and distribute them across the earth is to keep the people at the top of the pyramid at the top of that pyramid and the people at the bottom at the bottom. Nature's design is to keep us all at the top, equally thriving. So after Egypt was unified and the world left this golden age, with the early dynasties and for much of Egypt's history thereafter, the country came to be known as the Two Lands. So you see here that after this unification, everything we know about Egypt originates from this unification of these two lands, and no one goes before that. So when you talk to most Kemetic scholars and most historians, and you ask them about the beginning of civilization, they take you back to this unification period of these two lands, but they never take you back pre-dynasty or before the government. They don't want you to know that humans was doing just fine, living abundantly, being one with nature in these vegan-based societies before the first pharaohs and rulers came and messed it all up. They don't want y'all to know that. So they hide that story behind the evolution timeline and the world religious beginning stories, which deletes all of these millions of years of history where we was thriving in vegan-based societies called a golden age. So they wrote that out of history and then cursed the matriarchal or divine feminine aspect to hide this record. So again, with the early dynasties and for much of Egypt's history thereafter, the country came to be known as the Two Lands. And when you ask people what was going on a million years before this, they start talking about ape humans and Sasquatch and Bigfoot, because all of these million years of history was hid behind these dumb stories and this evolution timeline deception and the world religions, which parallel scientism evolution timeline. And Greece and Egypt are the two lands that influence the world today, and they hold a secret of our true human origins. So when you ask about human origins, they don't take you to the beginning of human origins. They take you to the beginning of what they call civilization, when humans were civilized and so-called tamed by the male rulers, because what they're telling you is before that we was these dumb, wild, ape-like creatures who was like Flintstone characters, very primitive in stone-type settings. But what they're symbolically telling you is that they're mocking the ancestors and deleting the Stone Age. The Stone Age was 4 million years ago, and we can find items that show very intelligent people who would be quote unquote civilized by today's definition. But the truth is that we're not civilized, and the people from this time were civilized. So when you ask historians about human origins, they don't take you back to the origins of humanity. They take you back to the origins of when humanity was governed over by rulers. And they call that the beginning of civilization, which means we civilized or we tamed you from a wild human to this synthetic, domesticated, meat-eating, unnatural creature today we call a human. Truth is, civilization then began in 3100 BC. Civilization ended in 3100 BC. If you look at the first Planet of the Apes movie, they subconsciously, subliminally told you that. So if you look at this timeline, you can see everything dating back what we call pre-dynasty or Herstory. They mock it, and you got this little ape-like creature filling up the timeline, and that's their way of saying all of the humans before governments ruled the world was stupid, when really it's the opposite. Ever since people started governing the mental of humanity, we've been the dumbest we ever been, the most genetically modified, and so far from our natural state. Remember, government means governmental. Before men govern our mental, nature did. And nature did a way better job. So understand what I'm telling you here in this overview, because we're going to get deeper into this as we move on into the series. Just remember that there's a lot of records of human origins before 3100 BC, and that our beginnings predate this date by millions of years, and that the deception on the timeline of humanity is the timeline starts off 7,000 years ago and deletes those millions of years of human records that show thriving vegan civilizations, because they don't want us to know the truth about who we are and what we once were in our natural state. So this unification in Egypt was a unification of two lands, and these two lands had two rulers that became today's Eastern and Western world. You know, you got the Pope and you got the Dalai Lama. This would be your two lands, your two rulers. And their succession was carried on through those two testaments of the Bible. The word testament is from the word testes, dealing with the male's testicles, which all he had was his testes and his word when he swore an oath. Today, we pledge allegiance the same way that the first pharaohs took their oath into the brotherhood. The succession of these royal families is still passed on today, and Pope Gregory's calendar hides our true natural time. So these two lands with the two rulers, we're talking about the first beginning of world superpowers uniting, the main two being Greece and Egypt, and it's affected the world back then when these powers established their throne, and they still affect the world today and continue to rule over us now. The rulers established a national administration and appointed royal governors during that time, and that's exactly the way they're doing it today. You got to go up the pyramid to see who's really in charge. But I'm showing you how they get their power here. I'm showing you how it was gained from pre-dynastic time to when they established their dynasties in 3100. So there was a state formation in Egypt going on. And we know that the Greeks, what we call Rome or Greece, was split up into states. And like I said, some was getting along, some wouldn't. And the same thing was happening in Egypt as we was transitioning from them gender wars. So all of these patriarchal states, after winning these gender wars, unified through the main two, which we know today as Greece and Egypt. So when you look around the world today, those the main two superpowers that influence the world. So state formation in Egypt was primarily indigenous in character, and it is likely that a common language, namely Egyptian, was spoken in Upper and Lower Egypt in variant dialects, which facilitated the unification. That's very important. It tells you that this Egyptian language was spoken in both parts of Egypt in different dialects. That's because, again, the word Egypt come from the word gypsy, and the Egyptians was a mixed culture like America today, a very transient culture, meaning most of all the quote-unquote races that's in America come from other places. We're gypsies, and we move around. The word American is equivalent to gypsy or Egyptian. The first Americans was the Egyptians. We even get the American flag from the throne of Osiris. That's where we get the design for the American flag, from Egypt. That was the first melting pot, one of the first world superpowers, as well as Greece. And it was all different mixtures of people creating this superpower, just like America today. That's what makes the American military so great, that they got one of each man's own working for them. So America ain't nothing new. The first America was in Egypt. If you look at the throne of Osiris, you can see where they even get the American flag. I keep telling you that the pyramid on the back of the dollar, the land we in, is influenced by the Greeks and the Egyptians. And the Greeks and the Egyptians all admire the rise of the first pharaoh, which is Narmer, and we're going to show you why later when we talk about him. So this Egyptian language was not a indigenous language, quote unquote. It was not a language that was spoken that was original to the peoples of that land, because what we call in Egypt was not exclusive to one people. It was just like America today. Everyone in America speaks American just about. You got Chinese American, Jamaican American, African American, Swedish American. You got all of these different people, but American is like a prefix to their native tongue. So they speak American, and they're an American citizen, and they speak the language of the nation, but they do have a original nation that they come from. So this was what was happening in Egypt and Greece. According to the oldest origin stories, there was only one language. They slyly tell you this in scientism when they give you the whole Pangea concept, but everything then break off from Africa and spread away. Everything broke off from Eden and spread away. This is your Pangea concept. The word pan meaning spread, and the word geo referring to geographics or the earth. This is talking about the first Exodus when we left the North Pole. There was one language, one spirituality, one ideology during this time. There was one language, and all of the languages we have today were born from that one language. Whatever that language was, that was the original language that was created by the Most High. When we journeyed from Eden, the languages start to change. As we transition and spread out, the languages started varying, and so did the cultures. With your gardening cultures and hunting, gathering cultures, the language start to change. With the beginning of new things are the beginning of new words. So with the rise of hunting, you had changes in the vocabulary and the lexicon to accommodate new ways of living. When the Bible tells you about the Tower of Babel, that's what it's telling you about. These drastic changes in consciousness and ideologies that coincided with the changes of how we think, talk, interact with each other and with nature. So language was one of them. And again, that's your Tower of Babel concept. But the thing about the Tower of Babel and all of these other myths like the Adam and Eve story is they hide these millions of years of human origins that predate the Bible. So that's why I'm bringing up the biblical mythology as I explain to you the recorded origins. There was a melting pot and a concentration of people at these areas that we call Egypt and Greece that became the two world superpowers when we left Eden. So before settling in these two world superpowers, people was just scattered about, living one with nature in these autonomous villages. So this Egyptian language that no one can seem to speak today, because if you ask someone to speak Egyptian, they wouldn't know what to say. I have yet to meet a person that can speak Egyptian language, and what they're speaking would be considered not Egyptian by definition. It would probably be considered a form of Arabic. The New World Order wasn't a finished work. It was a work in progress, and it never was finished. They still going to war now, trying to get people disconnected from their pagan roots and offer their land and into more concepts that condone these modern ideologies that plague us today. So the work wasn't done because you still got a lot of cultures that's still under those matriarchal concepts to this day who weren't tampered with. But the goal is to get rid of them all. But I think before they can get rid of them all, that this system is falling before us before they can complete this. And I think they always knew that they couldn't win against nature and us being what we naturally supposed to be. Keep that in mind. Egypt and Greece during this time was melting pots that spoke unified language like we speak with this American language. It's a mutt language, meaning it don't really belong to a particular person. It's a language that's birthed out of a mixture. It's a language that was born out of a unification or necessity. If you put a bunch of people in a room together that can't understand each other, over years, those people would create some type of language that they're using to communicate. So that's kind of like this Egyptic language or this American blended language that we're using. The result of all of these different people concentrating themselves into these areas that became the two world superpowers. Language was born out of that blending, and it was a common language, like I said, namely Egyptian. But what we call an Egyptian was spoken in both lands in variant dialects, and that facilitated the unification. So think of America. This nation could not be a nation if we didn't have one language that united all of these different races of people. If you had all of these different people in this melting pot that couldn't understand each other, how would this be a nation? How would it be one nation? It'd be a bunch of different nations split up with confusion. So in order for you to create this new world order, unification, order out of chaos, you have to reorganize the people under a different tongue that support your different social ideologies, that support it with different spiritualities that condone unnatural acts. And there's a language that's born out of those societies. We're speaking it now. It unites the heads of the beast. So everything we know about this king that rose to power after this unification was given by a historian named Manetho. And Manetho was not a real person. So when we start talking about Narmer in the future, we're going to have to pay attention to a lot of the historical accounts that we gain most of our information about Narmer from. We have to question the accounts as well. So I'm not going to leave no stone unturned. That's why I want to do this in parts. And I don't want to talk about Narmer now, because everything I've been giving you thus far is just an overview of the entire series. Then we're going to actually start from day one and work our way up to 3100 BC. But there was no need in doing all that without this overview, because then you wouldn't have a clue what's going on, how the timeline is to be read, how they was counting time down at a certain point, then counting up, what was going on during the transition. We need this overview before we go through this timeline, so we understand how the timeline is to be studied, and actually how it was made, why it was made, and what splits the timeline, as I showed you previously. So the timeline is split by drastic shifts in consciousness and paradigm shifts, and the last shift was the creation of something we call government 7,000 years ago, and that was synonymous with the rise of hunting-based societies, as we went over. So what I'm going to do when we leave the introductory phase of this series is start from the golden age and what I think life was like during this time. And I'm going to show you some of the artwork and spiritual systems that come from that time and how they was changed. But we got to go all the way back to this time that was deleted, and we got to reveal the Great Mother. And we got to talk about her story, because all we know about is his story. Who is him, Brother Sanchez? Narmer, Manetho. All origins trace back to Rome or Egypt or Narmer to hide our pre-dynastic roots. We had a very beautiful history, or should I say herstory, before this unification and before we was so-called kicked out of the garden. And I want to talk about that time. But before I was able to do that, I had to give us an overview of the complete timeline and the deception that took place, how we go from her story to his story. We're going to go into detail and look at some of the cultures during that time. And then we're going to show you the symbolism of these cultures and the things that was left behind by these cultures. And then we're going to show you how these symbols were corrupted when the patriarchs rewrote the spiritual texts to support the hunting ideologies. Because remember, they had to get new calendars that was based around the movement of the herds. And they had to have new spiritual systems that was condoning meat eating when they abandoned the original laws of nature and the matriarch system. So most of the world are unaware of those pre-dynastic spiritual entities and symbols and revered spiritual systems and deities that ruled this pre-dynastic golden age. Most people don't know about the deities of this time, because they think everybody during this time was ape-like Flintstone dumb people. They want us to really believe that people during this time before the Pharaoh rule didn't even have a God consciousness. And they want you to believe that the people didn't have a consciousness of the creator, that they was that dumb they didn't know there was a creator for this creation. That's blasphemy. The reason they tell you that those people didn't have a God consciousness because there was no God during the pre-dynastic time. The word God is equivalent to the word pharaoh or president or male ruler. And there were no male rulers in the pre-dynastic time, so they're right. The pre-dynastic people didn't have a God consciousness. When the pharaoh rose to power, the people did not revere nature anymore, but they were forced to worship the pharaoh. So we got to understand how now this peasantry system was created under the pharaoh. Now, everything we know about the first pharaoh was given by the historian Manetho. And the reason Manetho gave this story is because they had to create a pseudonym to transfer the royal succession. We were leaving a time where women held a succession of our natural inheritance through the royal succession of the woman in the matrilineal system, now to the man passing down rulership. And the matriarch was hijacked by the patriarchs in the Garden of Eden via mythology when the woman was demoted when they put the womb on the man and they made life come through the man's lineage or Adam's rib. So they created the woman and the children through Adam. But since he didn't have a womb to give birth, they had to create him a womb to give birth. And for the first time ever, not only inheritance-wise was the royal succession now being passed through the males, but in spirituality, for the first time ever, we start to see male deities give birth. So for the first time ever, with the rise of Narmer and the patriarchs, for the first time ever in our spiritual mythology, which is humanity's way of passing down the laws and knowledge of nature, for the first time ever, that spirituality was corrupted, and now male deities were able to give birth. And then you start to see a bunch of weird deities start popping up that replaced these pre-dynastic deities that represented the womb. So after pre-dynastic time, when we get in the dynastic era, you start to see these weird looking deities of males with vaginas and males doing weird sex acts to create life. Because when they replaced the woman in society and we left the matriarchal golden age of the goddesses and the gardeners, again, the calendars and the spiritual texts and all of that had to be redone to support new social ideologies. So for the first time in this new world or this new system, the male gods were able to give birth, since now the males controlled nature and provided life or sustenance to the people. As above, so below. This drastic change in agriculture and males now taking rulership over the earth and nature through hunting, as opposed to the women gardeners, is synonymous with the change in consciousness and new deities that represent those new ideologies and social changes. So at first, where you had natural deities that represent the uterus and do unto others as you would have them do unto you, now you have ferocious male deities that distribute things unevenly based on favoritism, bloodshed. Killing animals was not only permitted, but was required for sacrifice, and bloodshed was the currency, as opposed to love, compassion, and the golden rule and planting seeds, reaping what you sow. Blood now is the currency, meat or money. Every dollar printed requires the destruction of nature. What we know about this first pharaoh was told under a pseudonym name to hide those who are pulling the strings behind the scenes, hiding this pre-dynastic record of our human origins behind this historic deception. This first pharaoh, which starts the genetics of the royal families and starts the succession that we read about in Genesis, which is the genetics of Adam. Adam is the Sumerian Atum, the Egyptian Menes or Narmer. It's this unified king that rose to power after the patriarchs won. In other words, it was the first world pope. Now, the Pope worked together with the Dalai Lama to resell this same Gregorian calendar and evolution timeline to the Eastern world. And he had to be more subtle than the Pope. So you see these two kings still ruling, and they are part of royal families, a puppet in the forefront of that royal family system. So it's a network of royal families creating what we call world governments. They give you a national flag, but they rule under family crests. And these families make up the Eastern Western world governments. And the governments are basically a bunch of royal families perpetuating a great calendrical deception and a great timeline evolution deception. And by perpetuating that deception, they can continue the succession of their royal bloodlines based on our ignorance of who we are. Remember, Narmer is supposed to be an Egyptian pharaoh, but everything we know about this Egyptian pharaoh is told through a Greek historian. And right there, you can see the Greco-Egyptian relationship, because during the rise of Narmer, the Greeks and Egyptians were now united and had the difficult task of rewriting history and hiding these 4 million years of golden age societies. So Manetho is another pseudonym like Plato and Aristotle. These are names that they give you to hide who's really giving you this fake history, because if we knew who it was, we would probably do something about it. But how do you find Manetho's family? How do you find Plato's family and Aristotle's family? You can't, because these guys don't have a last name. They can't be traced back to a family. And this is what hides the royal family's hands and keep their hands clean. You get mad at Plato and Manetho for the deception when they don't exist. It's really the royal families giving you a fake history to hide Herstory, or the time of the mothers when they ruled and we were in our natural state. And until we learn about this natural golden age state, then what the average person thinks is that everything was always this way, with animals hunt animals and people preying on people and people ruling over people. We think that the Most High created it this way. That's because when you were born, when they told you in the beginning, they didn't give you your real beginning. So I'm doing that right now so we can get back to the truth that's hidden behind the lie. Now, everything we know about this first pharaoh is written under a pseudonym name, because this is when they started manipulating the true records of our human origins and hiding our true human origins behind these royal families. So the first wars you read about are really the wars of infighting amongst those royal families that was ruling over those peasants. And they make their infighting wars your problem and start recruiting the peasants to fight their war. And that's still going on today. The people that's killing each other being funded by the same parties. So the first wars they teach you about in history are amongst the Greeks and the Egyptians, or Islam and the Greeks, Islam against the Egyptians, and etc. But before that, they don't tell you that before those wars were gender wars that even created those world powers and took us away from our family inheritance in nature. You think the first war started off with world superpowers arguing about who get what, and therefore you think the Most High created a world of war where there wasn't enough sustenance to sustain everybody and everything. So even the God of your Bible and your Quran had a military to go and take something from someone else, because they're basically telling you the creator didn't create enough. So the creator, to make up for being imperfect and not creating substantially and abundantly, then the creator started to decide in which people get what by making its own armies and going to war basically with its own creation, making its own creation war against each other because it didn't create enough. But that's blasphemy. The true creator created more than enough, and we never had to war for resources. The first wars took place. It's the reason why we left our abundant golden age societies, and now we war for resources because men are in control of the resources and they're not distributing them abundantly how nature would have it. Because the moment abundance is created, it's the end of the royal succession, which is maintained by scarcity, and is maintained by you needing them to supply it for you, because they're telling you nature didn't supply enough, but they want to be able to supply just enough to keep them in power and you working for it. So everything we know about this first pharaoh is written under a pseudonym to hide the real face of the real bloodline that's ruling over us. And they've been keeping a record of their bloodline throughout quote unquote history and in mythology. So the biblical historical account parallels the quote unquote scientific historical account. And that's one of those things that make you go, how is that possible? It's not a coincidence that the scientists of the world are supporting what the religions say, because they all have to sell to you the timeline of evolution. And they have to deny that there was any intelligent human prior to 3100 BC, or what's known as the Golden Age, because if they reveal that to you, you will know the truth that everything was created in a perfect natural state, and there was a great fall that was a result of patriarchy and male rulers, and that had nothing to do with the woman. So according to this historian Manetho, 3rd century BCE, an Egyptian historian and priest who lived during the Ptolemaic era, he was an Egyptian historian, but he was a Greek. Remember, Greece and Egypt was already unified. Manetho is telling us the story of Narmer, and he's the pharaoh that was the first ruler after the unification. So he's telling us about this unified ruler who was the first world pope, replacing the matriarchal system with the patriarchal New World Order. Now, a lot of people like myself question the existence of Narmer. Keep in mind, Narmer was the first form of all of these patriarchal deities that's been worshipped around the world today, such as Jesus and etc. And his succession was passed on through these patriarchal deities because their mythology is another form of history or history. So all of these deities have the same titles. For example, Narmer was also referred to in a lot of ways as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Sounds familiar? And just like Jesus and many other deities, what we know about these deities doesn't come from the time of those deities. For example, everything we know about Jesus, Narmer, and other deities that's synonymous with them, we don't get these records from the time of the deities. Even though people were keeping records during the time of the deities, we don't find the records of these guys until what I call great historical forgeries. So if you look at the time of Manetho, it was approaching year 1. And when they was scuffling to redo the calendars, they was also deleting all pre-dynastic accounts. So y'all all ought to find it strange that when we talk about these quote unquote great men like Jesus and Narmer who did these miraculous things, the only records of these men come from sources that are just as non-trustworthy as the deities themselves. Jesus don't have a last name. Aristotle don't. Manetho don't. Narmer don't. I have a last name. You can trace my bloodline. So we're talking about fictitious pseudonyms used to hide what really was going on. So as we was approaching year 1, they were rewriting history. And this meant deleting Herstory and teaching the new generations that everything prior to the first king was Flintstone land. Now, according to the historian Manetho, who was an Egyptian historian and priest, the first king was Menes, and we know that his reign was around 3100 to 3050 BC. Now, however, the earliest recorded king of the first dynasty was Hor-Aha, and his reign was from 3050 BC to 3049 BCE. Now, this king Hor-Aha is synonymous with Menes by many historians, so don't let that confuse you. All of this time of 3100 BC up until 2600 BC represents the time of Narmer. And in 2600 BC, it's the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the first intermediate period, which splits up these kingdoms, and we'll talk about these intermediate periods later. First, we need to go from Herstory to Hisstory. So remember, prehistory begins 5 million years ago all the way up into 3100 BC. And from 3100 BC to 2600 BC would be the rise of the first dynasties or the old kingdoms. And the first ruler of that time was called Narmer, who rose to power in 3100 BC. And he was the first king to claim to have united the two lands. And he was the final king of the proto-dynastic period. And remember, the proto-dynastic period just mean a transitioning period of pre-dynastic to dynastic. So there was a couple of thousand years that it took to transition from the golden age or the pre-dynastic age to the dynastic age. And that transitioning period was during the time the gender wars took place. They call that the proto-dynastic period. because dynasties weren't yet established. This was the transitioning period that laid the foundation for those first dynasties to be established. The end of those wars was the birth of this new era that we're in after that transitioning. They couldn't establish themselves until they killed all the old world armies. So there were old matriarchal armies going to war against these guys. And they died along with a lot of the concepts and practices of the Golden Age. With the rise of Narmer, that was the end of the proto-dynastic period and the official beginning of the dynastic period, because now your dynasties is established. The war has been won against the matriarchs, and the patriarchs are on the throne. But we didn't just go from these autonomous villages right into dynasties on the throne. There was a lot of years it took the transition, and they call that the proto-dynastic period. So it is possible that all three names refer to the same person when we talk about Menes, Narmer, and Hor-Aha. It's not only possible, it's very strongly believed by most historians that the same person was ruling during this time from 3100 BC to around 3040 BC. It was Narmer, but he was known by so many names that there's a lot of confusion. The reason he's known by so many names is the same reason the Pope is known by so many names around the world. The title Pope can be translated into many different words around the world, and for many years it have been. The title Pope is also the equivalent of the title King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the Anointed One, Father, Abba, and many more. Back in these times, we have to keep in mind that the first forms of government were ran by the religious order. So your bishops were military men, and your pope was the equivalent of the landlord. So it makes sense when we go to talking about all of these conspiracies of the royal families who so-called played part in writing the Bible. This was the earliest form of media, which was book writing. We know Gutenberg himself was also a Jew. But what we're talking now is how the first dynasties was also responsible for rewriting history, making a new calendar, and also coming with new religious texts to support this new world order. So now you can see how the first families, those in power, played the roles in the religious texts and how it all relate to the world religious deception. They're at the top of all world deception, and the world religious deception was them rewriting the text by deleting Herstory and hijacking the throne and now making the royal succession go through the patriarchs instead of all humans receiving their natural inheritance. So that Genesis in the Bible begins the succession of those royal families and their bloodlines. We're dealing with genealogy, Genesis. And when you talk about succession, the root word of it is success. They've been succeeding for the past 7,000 years based upon the failure of the people to rise up and wake up. When you trace back history to 3100 BC, everybody telling the same story about this first king, but they giving them a different name, and they having many debates when really it's the same dude. These two world superpowers spoke a universal language to all of those cultures that settled there, but the language was spoken in different dialects. In Alabama, we say, "Give me that screwdriver over there." In the Midwest, only about 4 hours away, they say, "Give me that screwdriver over there." In just 4 hours, the dialect go from over there to over there. It go from over here to over her. In just 4 hours, dialect can change. So understand how this can be confusing when you look back at names and languages in the past. We forget that even back then, dialect played a role. So this Egyptian language varied by dialect, and this person called Narmer or Menes was called many names across the earth based upon varying dialect. So I kind of skipped ahead a bit and gave you a little information about Narmer. We're going to close this out by taking another look at our evolution timeline here. And just something else to recap on, you can see everything we went over on this timeline. You can see how from 5 million years ago all the way up to 7,000, 6,000 years ago, the time of Narmer was during this time of the Golden Age when humans was said to be in a Garden of Eden type setting. Now, about 7,000 years ago with the rise of Narmer also marks the ending of the proto-dynastic era, or the transitioning era of us coming from this golden age to the modern day New World Order slave system we're in today. So this timeline shows you the 5 million missing years all the way up to 7,000 years ago where we see the pyramids at. But it shows you all of that time again as apes and Flintstone creatures to hide the beauty of what we were. And they want you to think that we need the government and that there was no civilization prior to 6,000, 7,000 years ago. But we just went over how this is deception and blasphemy. I want you to keep this timeline in mind, because where those pyramids at, you can read it says civilization present day. They're telling you that the human changed his mind, the way he walked and talked and think and eat changed with the timeline. And for reasons I explained previously, that with the drastic change of consciousness, there's often changes in diets, which also leads to changes in the calendar, going from a vegan-based calendar to a calendar which is centered around the herds and the sun and the ruler and succession of the throne. So the calendars are centered around different things that's valuable to that society. And today's Gregorian calendar is centered around the New World Order rulers. And those calendars start 6,000 years ago, where we see these pyramids on this timeline. And they don't want you to go before their calendars because it shows you the truth. When you start off your human origins 7,000 years ago with their beginning, it hides this 5 million years behind ape stories and talking snakes and all of this stuff. We're going to be getting into that in detail. So we need to understand how this timeline deceives the world by deleting Herstory, by deleting pre-dynastic records of human origins, or what I call Herstory. So what we're going to do now is crank it up a notch now that we got this extensive overview out the way. In the next part, we're going to pick back up in pre-dynastic time and explore that era, and we're going to get a feel for the golden age and how we were living during this time, because this timeline only have this blasphemy to explain what was going on. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Flintstones, all of the stuff we were taught. What was really going on and what was society like during that time? Let's get real and let's not deal with the ape-like creatures and the Darwinism and the evolution deception. Let's talk about what was really going on during pre-dynastic time before we was ruled over by governments and dynasties. So stick around for the next part, because now that we got this overview done, we're going to start off in that time and work our way back to Narmer in 3100 BC. And then we're going to eventually work our way from there all the way up to present day 2018, going from the beginning to the end of the whole timeline. I think so far I've done a great job explaining the why, but there's still more to explain. The rabbit hole goes deep. But like I said, in order to make this a thorough series, it was important that I give an overview before just hopping right into Herstory to Hisstory. So this is part 1 of the series. And after this, we'll actually go back over this stuff in greater detail on the timeline and show you exactly how, in more detail, how this stuff was achieved and exactly what happened. And also what was going on during these 5 million years of history that we were never taught about. What was life like? We're going to be spending a lot of time in that pre-dynastic golden age era because they didn't teach us about this. And first couple of parts of the video is going to be dedicated to showing us our true origins and what life was really like before governments and dynasties ruled over us, how beautiful life was, how simple it was, and the different deities that we created and the different ideologies and figurines and It's going to be awesome. We're going to start there. And like I said, we're going to work our way up to the gender wars and proto-dynastic period, and then to the first kingdoms or the old kingdoms. And then we're going to eventually work our way all the way up to today. But we had to get this video out the way, this overview, so we know how to even approach the timeline and the nature of the deception we dealing with, so I don't talk over your heads when we start going from year to year. Some people don't even know that they was count time backwards. So if I just start a lecture saying, hey, in 3100 BC, this happened and that happened, and just start talking like they know, you lose them. So I want to be very accurate, because there was a lot of deception took place. And on our quest for truth, we need to be careful, accurate, honest, and thorough. They deleted the truth, and I'm going to do the accurate timeline according to the ancients and show you exactly what year we are in today, because it's not 2018. Someone messed up the true time. This is going to be a very important and extensive and thorough series of videos. And if you pay attention to what I'm saying, and if you have to watch it twice, do so. But it's going to take a lot of hours of teaching to undo this deception. So this marks part 1 of Herstory to Hisstory. And really, it's just an overview of what we're going to be going over. So basically, I just gave you Herstory to Hisstory from A to Z, but I didn't give it to you in detail. And there's so much we need to know on exactly how we get from Herstory to Hisstory still. So I gave you Herstory to Hisstory and the main points of how it happened. But I know many of you won't fully grasp the timeline until I go in detail, starting from 5 million years ago, the parts they deleted, and working our way up to the time of when they started creating history and hiding her story and creating the calendrical deception. So I got to start from the true time 5 million years ago. And before that, no one even knows how far back it goes. It's up to your belief before that. 5 million years ago, that's the time where a lot of people agree that we can trace human origins back to. We can actually say that life existed prior to that, based upon we can't prove it didn't. All we know is that it's here and it's been here. But to make a long story short and to make the series thorough, we're dealing with the historical timeline deception of our human origins. Therefore, when we crank it up in the next series, we'll start off 5 million years ago, because I can at least show you some type of art and figurines that is said to be dated back to 1 million years ago. And these artifacts, when you decipher what they mean, supports the verbal oral record or account that was passed down from humans before them. So this verbal account is millions of years old and can be traced back to 5 million years ago. And we can see solid physical proof of these verbal accounts of human origins, where we come from, who we are. We start to see physical proof when these verbal accounts start to be personified and deified into figurines and carvings and art. We start to prove this 5 million year old verbal account with million-year-old artifacts that come from up out of the early Stone Age. So we're talking about artifacts that come from out of the early Stone Age or Paleolithic Age, which was 1.5 million to 2.5 million years ago, all the way back to 4 million years ago. We're talking about the Paleolithic or the Old Stone Age, because we're talking millions of years ago, and the only proof of civilization is stone figurines, stone artifacts. And that is very interesting, because that's what we're talking about when we look at this timeline of evolution. Australopithecus will be 5 million years ago, which would be the Stone Age. And that's not an ape-like primitive creature that's dumb. We see some of the most intricate figurines and carvings during this time, proving that we have been bamboozled by our world governments, that the timeline of evolution is blasphemy, deception, and it's false. 5 million years ago, there were very intelligent vegan-based societies, and in the next part of this series, we will be exploring the lifestyle of those early societies that we call Stone Age societies. It was a beautiful time. That's why they wrote it out of our human records and hid it behind Hisstory. If you have to watch this again, do so and get this in you, as well as the Ripple Effect series, so that when we move forward, you won't be lost. Stay tuned for my live streams on FLATPOWER TV and Bro Sanchez Live. Many of you have heard I can't live stream on this channel for 3 months, so I can't do Q&A here. If you want to ask me questions about my channel or any of my teachings, make sure you subscribe to FLATPOWER TV, Bro Sanchez Live. These are my backup channels that I always go live on and do Q&A and open panels. Also debates and live discussions and one-on-ones. So get in the video description area. Make sure you subscribe to my backup channels, FLATPOWER TV and Bro Sanchez Live. Make sure you visit my website, brosanchez.com, for all things Bro Sanchez. Appreciate you all for your support, and I want to give a huge shout out to my family of Patreons. I'm going to let you guys get out of here because it's been an extensive video. This wraps up this overview introduction of Herstory to Hisstory. I know I didn't talk about a lot. That's because the actual series will start in the next video, where we're going to be very thorough and go through the different ages and kingdoms in detail. Now, I can only get so much in detail on this one to compress this overview. Just look at this one over and then tune in with the next ones with me, and you'll have a clear understanding of our true human origins and how they was hidden by the timeline of evolution and the deception of the powers that be. So I hope that you guys continue this journey with me, because this is just the beginning. You haven't heard nothing yet. So remember to check out brosanchez.com, hit the like button on this video and share it. And remember, new uploads every Thursday. Peace and much love.